Okay, well, thank you. This is Jennifer Gerardo. I'm the Director for Broward County's Environmental Planning and Community Resilience Division and the county's Chief Resilience Officer. I very much appreciate everyone being here today with both me and Dr. Samantha Danchuk, our Assistant Director, for the purpose of reviewing the Priority Planning Area Map Update. This is the second community workshop, and I believe the last that we'll be holding as part of our online outreach, or at least in the way of the virtual environment. Dr. Danchuk will talk about our receipt of additional comments through an online platform and some of the process beyond the presentation of today. So today's presentation is for the purpose of providing a bit of context to the update of the Priority Planning Area Map, which I will deliver, and then Dr. Danchuk will talk about the specifics of the update. Next slide, please, Sam. So just as a little bit of background, I think that many are familiar with the county's ongoing efforts to advance climate resilience planning through regional assessments and hydrologic modeling and various evaluations and action strategies that are undertaken as part of our county operations, and also as part of the county's participation in the four-county collaborative, the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Action Plan. These efforts, including a lot of the hydrologic modeling, date back to the early 2000s, and we've seen a lot of advancements and the robustness of the tools that we have available to support our planning initiatives. And so part of the point being that this has been a very iterative process, I think, for all communities engaged in climate resilience initiatives, as our ability to integrate additional science into the technical tools has evolved and allowed us to be more strategic in our planning activities. And so you can see, just with examples provided here, we have the context of the four-county regional climate action plan that really provides a framework for assuring the highest level of possible alignment in our coordinated strategies, recognizing that there's so much connectivity between our communities and our resources and the systems that we rely upon. There have been key work products that have evolved from the four-county effort, including the regionally aligned sea level rise projection that we'll talk about in today's presentation. And then this work doesn't at all supplant the need for local planning or that happens at a community-wide basis. And so Broward County has a climate action plan. Of course, our cities have various climate and sustainability plans, and integrated in these efforts are diverse considerations of climate change and sea level rise impacts in particular, such as those affecting water supply, water management, drainage, and flood control, and various types of infrastructure in our environment, and increasingly the evaluation of cascading impacts, as we understand resilience isn't built in isolated siloed systems, but it comes through the coordinated protections that are derived through organized planning and investment decisions. So the next slide, please. So in our evaluations, and of course really recognized at the national level, that there are certain consequences that are of unique consideration for those in the coastal environment. Some of the pressures of climate change and sea level rise are especially severe when we look at the combined impacts of rising seas coupled with intensification of rainfall and the potential to have augmented storm surge, all kind of coinciding at a single point in time. I call that the trifecta, and where we have a concentration of assets and individuals, our dense populations concentrated in these same areas, there's very unique and significant exposures for communities such as ours. And we see increasingly these examples across the landscape, whether we're looking at increased tidal flooding, increased and more severe inland flooding, which of course we regularly communicate that these impacts are not isolated to the coast, and there's plenty of evidence of that. But we do have some acute conditions, of course, that do occur in the coastal environment as we look at vulnerabilities such as storm surge. So the next slide, please. So these recognitions have driven a number of more acute evaluation of where we have within our planning environment and in our capital investment strategies additional opportunity to build resilience into the way that we plan for and design within our community. And there are diverse considerations, and you can see here examples from not only within Broward County but across our region as we're all making similar alignments, whether they're county or local investments. These include things such as site-specific raising of seawalls, elevating of roads and even bridges, installation and upsizing of stormwater pumps and systems. And then here we have a very large-scale stormwater valve. And so all these investments taking place throughout the community, some site-specific and increasingly part of coordinated strategies. And so we know that there are opportunities, whether we're looking at land use or where we choose to put infrastructure, how we might harden infrastructure, how we might design differently for future conditions. And that might include expanded infrastructure, elevated infrastructure, or relocated infrastructure. Next slide, please. And so kind of moving into this idea of an iterative or stepwise process, as I shared, a lot of the early activities were taking place in early 2000, but we didn't necessarily have all the tools that are available at a single point in time in order to kind of roll out, new procedures in all aspects of our work. And in fact, we rely quite heavily on existing tools and processes. And as we were advancing the second iteration to the regional sea level rise projection, we recognized that the implications of sea level rise on the landscape were far more complex than what can be derived simply through, bathtub modeling. That was one of the most expeditious ways and frankly one of the more efficient ways to begin to really capture areas of vulnerability and begin to think about resilience requirements where clearly we have an exposure while we work on some of the more integrated planning that would follow. So when the 2015 sea level rise projection was adopted, this was already fairly consistent with some of our early planning that had commenced with the compact in 2010. And so we had begun working on the first step in our process, which was integrating sea level rise consideration into our comprehensive plan and land use planning. And in 2012, and then updated in 2015, was our priority planning area map. So this is a map that's included in the comprehensive plan as part of the land use element. This went through stakeholder outreach and was ultimately adopted. And this is the area highlighted in purple here, is the area of the county that was delineated to be at increased risk of exposure to flooding with an increase of 2 feet in sea level rise. And the 2 feet was the kind of the targeted time frame, because we recognize that most of the planning that happens through local government is, in terms of larger infrastructure, is designed with a 50-year time frame in mind. So in our earlier process, we were focused on kind of the 2010 baseline and the predicted increase of about 2 feet of sea level rise, consistent with the Army Corps high projection for the 2060 timeframe. And so that was the basis for the inclusion of the 2-foot sea level rise scenario. Shortly after that, we were also able to advance work with the USGS, and we, in 2017, gained support for an updated groundwater table map, and that's the image shown on the right. And in 2017, this average, the map was updated to account for the predicted groundwater elevation for the wet season under this same 2-foot sea level rise scenario, as well as an anticipated increase in the rainfall conditions. This ends up being significant since our drainage and stormwater management infrastructure is designed with in an accounting for the amount of groundwater storage that's available in the soils, and as sea level rise causes a change in that groundwater table, water storage is reduced, and hence alterations to drainage and water management systems are required in order to ensure functionality over the life of the project. So again, that map was adopted in 2017. Next slide, please. Concurrent with these efforts, and perhaps many are familiar as it's relatively recent, the adoption, but we began in, I think it was about 2015, outreach to the Army Corps of Engineers requesting technical support in the evaluation of coastal water elevations predicted with the same increase of 2 feet in sea level. And this was driven by the recognition that we were addressing drainage. We would need to address resilience of infrastructure within the urban landscape, but we needed to get a hold on the volume of water that was entering through, so with trespass over seawalls and other low entry points, and we were finding a lot of disparity in the elevations of coastal infrastructure. We didn't have a consistent requirement for what we should be building for, and as investments were being made, perhaps the full realization of those best investments wasn't coming to fruition because the water would simply seep around the next lowest entry point. So in this work with the Army Corps of Engineers, again, this evaluation took place of hydrodynamic modeling to evaluate these future elevations, and the long and short of that effort is we ended up with a recommendation for guiding the top elevations for our tidal flood barriers, seawalls, berms, and other types of infrastructure for 5 feet NAVD by 2050, again counting for that 2-foot rise, coupled with high tides and high frequency storm surge. We did go through that technical process, and outreach and adoption occurred earlier this year. So that's another element of the resilient standards that were advanced, applying to the tidally influenced areas of the county, and also recognizing diverse means for achieving consistency with that standard, not necessarily seawalls. I just wanted to add that. So the next slide, please. And so the next part of our process has been one that we've been working on for a couple of years in the way of organizing investment, contracting, and now the work itself. And I bring this up because it's relevant to the rest of the work that's taking place, and it provides additional context. So as I shared earlier, when we commenced with the priority planning area map, we recognized that water management is and flood conditions are far more complex than what can only be derived by the priority planning area map. But certainly that map helps to prioritize and identify quite readily the exposures in the coastal areas. But we use a variety of tools for establishing what are the finished floor elevations for our commercial and residential structures, and that is driven by a variety of tools, including the FEMA flood map, most recently developed in 2014, and a current update that's in a review process that relates to the coastal A zone. We also have a community flood map that's specific to Broward County regulations, and that has been a forward-looking map that has predicted the flood elevation with community build-out. And over the years, the community flood map has quite often required a higher elevation than the FEMA map because it's been forward-looking. And as a result, we've been building to a higher standard, and many of the communities have gained advantage because of the additional flood reduction that is flood risk reduction that is achieved, as well as a whole we gain insurance discounts through the flood insurance program by building to higher standards. But over the years, as we've found additional pressures on our water management system, we found that flood elevations are evolving, and as the FEMA maps are being updated, our own community flood map has no longer providing the same sort of advantage or proactive position in terms of the standard that is referenced relative to the FEMA maps. And so the recognition has been this is no longer the most forward-looking tool, but instead we need to begin to accounting for the new future condition, which is the combined impacts of rising seas and more intense rainfall on what happens with our flood elevations. I make mention of it because this mapping, it has been part of a stakeholder process for the last year. We shared some early versions of the map on the beginning of this calendar year. You have shown here on the right one of the most recent iterations. It is not the final map, but you can see how this map on the right, our most recent model update, the future conditions, how it compares to the map on the far left, which is the most recent FEMA map. And then that map in the middle shows the coastal A zone update that is part of the work that FEMA is advancing today. Again, I share that work not only because of its relevance to the FEMA to our establishing resilience standards, which we would intend to bring forward an updated map later this year. But in addition, we undertook as part of this exercise a evaluation of trends for rainfall rates or intensity, as this is an area of evolution as well. And we established a 13% overall change in the intensity of the 3-day, 100-year rainfall event that was part of this combined modeling. So that modeling on that right takes into account the change in the groundwater table, the change in sea level, an October high tide, and the combination of that 13% increase in rainfall. So again, that's type of the work that's forthcoming. But all this is happening. Next slide, please. All of this is happening at the same time that we have just most recently updated our sea level rise projection. So while we're finalizing a lot of this this hydrologic modeling accounting for this 2 foot of sea level rise, we have also gained board approval by the County Commission for adjusting our planning horizon out another 10 years. So moving from the 2000 baseline to a 2010 baseline for the projection. Excuse me, I need to adjust myself. Originally it was 2010, now we're planning from 2020 forward, and that moves us to 2070 as the target horizon. We've also, with this curve, are now referencing not the Army Corps high, but the NOAA intermediate high as the target on this projection, and that brings us out to 40 inches of sea level rise, or 3.3 feet. So while, again, this is a very, a sustained process of continual investment, and it's always going to be stepwise because there's so much in the way of technical work that goes into being able to account for the science and then bring it forward into the policy environment. That additional modeling is forthcoming with those results, but at the same time, we're now moving forward with the next iteration to our planning efforts, which is that accounting now for the 3.3 feet of rise. So this graphic slide here is perhaps very reflective of one that I showed earlier, where we started with the sea level rise projection, our priority planning area map, and our groundwater table map. So we're commencing again that cycle. We are in the process of updating now the priority planning area map to account for that 40 inches of rise relative to 2000, and Dr. Danchuk is going to go through the details of that. We are also working with the USGS to update our groundwater table map that was adopted in 2017 to account for that same 40 inches or 33.3 feet of rise. And when that work is completed, we will also bring that information into our hydrologic modeling project, the one that I just shared. So the next slide, please. So my final slide for just the context setting is to acknowledge that we are at a critical juncture in terms of really being able to evaluate, well, how do we keep the maximum amount of water coming in from the coastal environment? How do we optimize our drainage and our water management infrastructure in accordance with the impacts that that sea level rise has on the groundwater table? And then thinking about, well, once we have accomplished these things, what about all of the existing infrastructure in our environment that isn't necessarily going to be part of, redevelopment with a whole new design standard? And so the next phase of this investment is taking that flood model, the community flood map, and the water levels that are derived from that to say, okay, on a county-wide basis with a holistic plan, where can we make the water management improvements, the storage improvements, the green infrastructure improvements, the integration into redevelopment strategy, shared water management infrastructure, through that type of plan that can be integrated as part of a sustained investment. How much of that additional flood risk can we mitigate through that type of modified and coordinated planning effort, and what does that coordinated investment do for us in terms of a return on investment, not only in flood risk, but economic advantage that's gained by reducing that risk that then translates to things like the insurance market and the finance market and the bond market, real estate values, and so forth. So simply stating that we're ready to commence on a next stage of really intentional planning, utilizing this hydrologic modeling results, accounting for the most recent projections that we have for sea level rise and rainfall trends. And that work will be underway in the next several years as we continue to update some of our existing tools. So now I'll go ahead and transition to Dr. Danchuk about the specifics of the priority planning area map. I know that we had a number of questions that have come in through the chat box, and I think we'll be able to, not that I think, but we'll go ahead and answer those at the time of that Dr. Danchuk wraps up her presentation. Thank you.
So in this graph, you'll see that sea level rise has been rising for thousands of years, but for the past 100 years, we've been measuring sea level rise at Key West. This is actually the longest record available in Florida. You'll see on this graph, the blue line shows the monthly mean sea level average over time from 1913 to 2017. And then the black line is actually an average over 5 years, and it kind of reduces down the variation so you can see the trend over time. Sea level has risen approximately 11 inches since 1913 through 2017, and this basically just is confirming that sea level is rising. And along with that, we've been experiencing more frequent nuisance flooding, and eventually we will be subject to permanent inundation. And the priority planning areas map denotes the areas of inundation under a sea level rise scenario for 40 inches of rise. And so an example of an inundation is shown here. You can see that it's water literally ponding on top of the ground, standing water, not draining. This leads to disruption in transportation systems, property damage, and loss of use of these areas. And so when you see the purple areas on the map, we're talking about the inundation and physically having standing water on top of the ground. So to show you a timeline of the policies that are relevant to the priority planning areas map. So in 2013, the first map was adopted. And then in 2013 also, the review process began to assess the inundation risks associated with proposed land use development, land use density changes, and application of the land use plan. In 2014, the first adaptation action area of regional significance was designated for the Port Everglades Sand Bypass project, and that's highlighted in yellow on the priority planning area map. In 2014 also, specific resilience criteria was included in the land use plan to specify the review process for any land use plan amendments that were submitted to densify the use of specific properties to ensure that they were meeting, certain resilient standards, so that even though we're allowing development in these vulnerable areas, the policy ensures that they are being developed resiliently. In 2015, the priority planning area map was revised to include the possible flooding areas, thereby expanding the affected zone. And then in 2017, the future groundwater table map was included as part of the future conditions map series. In 2019 is when the most recent unified sea level rise projection for Southeast Florida was updated. And then in 2020, as Dr. Jurado mentioned, was the adoption of the countywide tidal flood barrier elevation standard. And then in 2021, the updated 100-year community flood map will be forthcoming. And so really it was the projection that prompted the update of the priority planning area map. So this is the unified sea level rise projection for Southeast Florida. You can see that it consists of 4 curves and highlights a 20-year and a 50-year planning horizon. So the 50-year planning horizon is derived from assuming that structures and buildings have a 50-year lifespan before they would need to be replaced or removed. And so by 2070, according to the NOAA intermediate high curve, we are projected to experience 40 inches of rise above a 2,000 mean sea level elevation. And just to highlight the difference between these curves and how they should be applied, the IPCC median curve is the lowest curve on this projection, and it can be applied for most infrastructure that can be easily adapted or replaced, or maybe if it fails, it doesn't have a significant impact, whereas the NOAA intermediate high curve provides somewhat more of a very likely scenario for sea level rise and allows design for infrastructure that maybe is less adaptable or will be here for periods longer than or close to 50 years. And then the curves that are above that, the NOAA high and the NOAA extreme, provide the NOAA high curve specifically is to be applied for critical infrastructure that cannot be allowed to fail. For example, maybe nuclear power plants or a wastewater treatment plant that's adjacent to the coast. And then the NOAA extreme curve provides kind of an upper boundary of what sea level rise scenarios exist from the modeling, global and regional sea level rise projection modeling based on the current greenhouse gas emissions pathway that we're on. So the Broward Comprehensive Plan already includes policies to update the priority planning area for sea level rise map, along with vulnerability assessments every 5 years to ensure that adaptation planning is based on best available data. So as noted previously, the Southeast Florida projection for sea level rise will probably be updated every 4 or 5 years, and so there's a necessity to amend policies thereafter. This is the actual proposed map. So you can see the areas in purple are proposed to be inundated by sea level rise, meaning that was where they would experience you know, the high tide flooding, but also standing water in these areas. So that you can actually read the legend, I've copied it here. So the map identifies the areas near tidal water bodies at increased risk of inundation under 40 inches of sea level rise scenario, estimated to occur by 2070. All of the areas are east of the salinity control structures. It represents a mean higher high water, high tide condition. So sometimes we provide, for example, the sea level rise projection itself is actually referenced to an elevation of mean sea level, which would be mid-tide, but the actual priority planning area map shows you what high tide is, so that you can see the maximum area that would be flooded. And then specifically, if you wanted to compare it to surveys or building elevations or finished floor elevations or base flood elevations, the map shows areas that are inundated that are less than 3.86 feet according to the North American Vertical Datum of Elevation, so NAVD. To compare the existing map, which showed 2 feet of sea level rise by 2060, to the proposed map, which now shows 3.3 feet of sea level rise by 2070, referenced from 2000 mean sea level, you can see that there is an expansion in these purple areas and further inland propagation of the sea. In the chat box, and then also here at the bottom of this slide, I have provided an address for an interactive map so that you can actually zoom in and see at the property scale areas of interest with both the existing and the proposed map, so that you can see if an area that you are interested in has changed. The anticipated timeline for approval of this policy, in May, the package was submitted to the priority planning, the Planning Council, including the priority planning area map itself. In June and July, we are holding stakeholder outreach opportunities, including a previous presentation that was held in June, and then today's presentation. We will be collecting comments and feedback on the policy and the map throughout July, and you can email your comments to resilience@broward.org. In August will be the first Planning Council hearing to review the map. In September, the Planning Council will hopefully submit the package to the state for review, and staff will work to schedule the first public hearing at the Broward County Commission. And then hopefully by December, the Broward Commission will be holding their next hearing and reviewing the map for consideration of adoption and inclusion in the land use plan. So to give examples of how the priority planning area map has been applied to date, so there is a policy in the climate change element of the comprehensive plan that areas vulnerable to sea level rise need to be identified, as well as areas subject to tidal flooding and climate change impacts. So the map itself does that within the land use plan. Also, the comprehensive plan includes the policy to designate adaptation action areas, which are areas that need to be prioritized for sea level rise adaptation and should be highlighted and prioritized for funding as well. And so the first example of a adaptation action area to be designated for the region was the Port Everglades Sand Bypass project area, and this was to support permitting efforts with the Army Corps of Engineers. There are other examples. So the municipalities have also been designating adaptation action areas, and so on the right you'll see examples of areas within Fort Lauderdale that have been highlighted as vulnerable to sea level rise and in need of specific improvements. And so along with their adaptation action areas, they have the stormwater improvements and other projects necessary in order to make those areas more resilient as part of their planning efforts. I had mentioned previously that there is a land use plan amendment review process for property proposed densification of properties. And so here, just to kind of pull out some of the resilience criteria that's included in this review, staff considers the life of the infrastructure proposed, as well as the sea level rise projections. The municipalities are required to make a commitment as part of the submittal that they will maintain access to the site and support its long-term functionality. And the concern there is, you know, if the requirement is only on the property owner to build a resilient development, but there's no way to access that property, or all the connected infrastructure is not maintained, then it doesn't really serve the purpose of the policy, which is to enhance the resilience, of the entire vulnerable area, ensure that it was developed properly. Also, as part of this review, we'll look at previous permits that were issued to ensure that there's full recognition that there needs to be plans for future conditions, and that even specifically in their design, they need to be considering you know, the future needs for their seawall heights, for their on-site storm drainage, for the finished floor of the buildings, and for you know, the drainage of the streets and the parking lots and everything connected to the property itself. So future applications for the priority planning area map. These are the climate change element policies that are relevant in the comprehensive plan. The first is to promote land uses with functional, walkable, mixed-use development designs, and the projects necessary to do that within the priority planning areas, to continue to improve the mapping of the areas as science and data becomes available, to encourage use of adaptation and mitigation strategies and within these vulnerable areas, or discourage density increases within these areas if those resilience criteria cannot be met, to add adaptation action areas, and to adopt a countywide transfer of development rights program to allow for protecting areas where resilience strategies are appropriate, and then directing development to more suitable areas, including activity centers where that's not feasible. So to give you a little bit of a zoomed in view of what the proposed map looks like, I have extracted a stretch from Deerfield Beach to Pompano Beach. So you can see in yellow is the previous map, and then in purple is the proposed map. And so you can see in the areas of purple, there is a considerable addition within some of these low-lying areas that's been added to the map. This is for Pompano Beach to Fort Lauderdale. So again, the areas in yellow were the previous map, and the areas in purple are the proposed map. From Fort Lauderdale to Dania Beach, you'll see some significant changes in this area. And then from Dania Beach to Hallandale Beach, and as noted, these views are actually extracted from the interactive tool that I mentioned. So that link is in the chat box if you'd like to look at that while we hold our discussion. And so again, please email your comments on the policy and the map to resilience@broward.org. And more information can be found at broward.org/climate. And also on our YouTube channel, I'll post the recording of this presentation, and the link is at Broward ENV. So with